afternoon, all my groovy guys and gals. This is WMUCFM College Park, and you're listening to The Old All Told. Alright, you guys, we're going to be kicking it up a notch. Next up, we've got Killin' the Name Of. The extremely anti-authoritarian tune transformed the climate of protest music, and there's no shock that 30 years later, its power still holds. In 1991, Rodney King and his two friends were driving around Fernando Valley, LA, when members of the California Highway Patrol spotted the car speeding, and shortly after, a chase ensued. Officers claimed Rodney resisted arrest when in reality he had been tased, kicked, and beaten by 4 officers with batons. This lasted 15 minutes and he'd been hit at least 50 times. As all this occurred, more than a dozen cops stood idly by. King's injuries resulted in skull fractures, broken bones and teeth, along with permanent brain damage. Across the road, a man named George Holliday captured the beating and took it to the news. The officers were charged with excessive use of force but ultimately found not guilty. People were outraged, and less than 3 hours later, the unrest began. Tom Morello, guitarist for Rage Against the Machine, knew immediately what had to be done, and the musicians captured the anger of the Rodney King incident in Killing in the Name Of. The band draws connection between the brutality caused by the police force and the Ku Klux Klan. Years later, that same guitarist, Tom Morello, continued to use his voice and was outspoken in his support for the Black Lives Matter protests that arose in the wake of George Floyd's death. Without further ado, here's Killin' in the Name Of. Coming up next, we've got Ohio by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. The meaning of the song is imperative today in the presence of increased gun violence, especially in the hands of those whose duty it is to protect the innocent. On May 4th of 1970, 4 Kent State University students were killed and 9 left injured. The tragedy took place when members of the Ohio National Guard opened fire on a crowd gathered to protest the Vietnam War. Students were protesting a planned military bombing in Cambodia in which Nixon would invade a neutral nation, illegally expanding the scope of U.S. involvement in the war. Neil Young wrote the song after seeing photos of the massacre in Life magazine. The song featured a rush release and was made available to the public 10 days after its creation. Ohio calls urgency to the gun problem in the United States that appears to be never-ending. If Stevie Wonder knew anything, it was how to make a powerful political point and get it to the people. When Wonder released, You Haven't Done Nothing, it went all the way to #1 on both the American R&B and pop charts. The track is an unquestionable criticism on the political status quo. Released during the Watergate scandal, it's clear Wonder's contempt was aimed at President Richard Nixon. 2 weeks after the release, Nixon was forced to resign the presidency. Stevie was furious. He said, "Everybody promises you everything, but in the end, nothing comes of it." Sick of performative activism, Stevie shared his voting beliefs, essentially stating his tick will be provided on the basis of action, not hopeful words. The meaningful song's infectious, backed with funk and the vocals of the Jackson 5, leading to a message that's not only palatable, but exciting.